Hi, this is Daf Kaf Zayin, page 27 of Daf Shevui. I thought I would do something a little bit historical for you, something of a historical interest. Usually when we read the Talmud, we're reading something that's very highly theoretical. As I've said many times, there is not a lot of historical information in the Talmud, but sometimes we find things mentioned in the Talmud that do have historical, let's say, recollections or evidence that these are historically somewhat accurate from elsewhere. So the Mishnah back on Kaf Vav Amud Bet had said that if a woman was imprisoned by Gentiles, if she was imprisoned for monetary purposes in order to gain money back from whoever would, let's say, ransom her back, then she's permitted to go back to her husband. But if it was for purposes of executing her, then she's forbidden to go back to her husband. And the Gemara gives several examples of women who are taken imprisoned due to the crimes of their husbands, and they are taken in order to be executed. The first example is Rav says, Kagon Nashe de Ganave, simply women, wives of thieves. And Rashi explains that in the time of the Mishnah, the Romans, when they would sentence a thief to death, they would basically send their wives out to prostitution, and therefore we have to suspect that this woman has been made into a prostitute, and therefore she may not go back to her husband. Levi says, Kagon Ishto Shel Ben Dunai, like the wife of Ben Dunai, the son of Dunai. And you got to ask, who's Ben Dunai? So Rashi and most of the Mefarshim, most commentaries identify this with Masechet Sota, the Mishnah there in chapter 9, Mishnah 9 reads, from the time that there were many murderers, Batla Agla Rufa, they got rid of the heifer whose neck is broken when we have an unidentified murderer. If this just happens too often, then there's not much we can do about it, and no longer do we break a neck over the isolated case of murder because there are simply too many murders. But the Mishnah goes on, Misha ba Elazar ben Dinai. When did there start to be too many murders? From the time that Elazar ben Dinai came into the world. And this figure, Elazar ben Dinai, I'm sorry, I'm just moving the camera. I usually rest it here on my computer so that I can talk to you without holding the phone all the time, which is what I use to video myself. I'm reading for you from Josephus, from the book Antiquities of the Jews, which is his history of the Jews, where he mentions somebody named Elazar, the son of Dinais. In the first instance that I wanted to mention, there's this guy, Elazar ben Dinai, who is called by Josephus a robber, and he had been many years making his abode in the mountains, somewhere between the Galilee and Judea, and he's engaged in an attack on the Samaritans. There's some kind of a war between the Samaritans and the Jews on the, let's say, the passage of the Jews from the Galilee have to pass through the Shomron, Samaria, to make their way to Jerusalem, and the Samaritans were attacking them and ambushing them and killing them. And there's a whole long story in in book 20, chapter 6 of Josephus, in which this character, Elazar, the son of Dinaius, is involved. Later on in the same chapter, I believe actually chapter 8, section 5, it refers to Nero, right, who became the emperor, and he tries to instill order throughout his empire. But the Josephus refers to Felix, a man by the name of Felix, who was the governor of Judea. And one of the things that this Felix, who's appointed by Nero, getting closer to 70, the destruction of the temple, does is he catches Eleazar, the son of Dinais, who had gotten together a company of robbers. And then it goes on to explain the story of how he sent him to Rome to have him tried. Now, I'll finish up with a couple other Eleazars, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but there are other scholars who identify this Eleazar as being the beginning of the zealotry against Rome, the zealous, let's say, radicals who were living in Jerusalem, who began to foment the seditious war that eventually in 70 CE led to the destruction of the temple. But I happen to think that we're safer with the Talmudic identification, where he is known as a robber and not a political leader.